Vibrant health, a clear-thinking, happier mind, and vastly improved athletic performance. The Renaissance Humans podcast is all about pointing out what almost everyone is leaving on the table. We're focused on science-based methods of lifespan extension, disease avoidance, and mental performance improvement. We're about making life better through diet and lifestyle changes. Whether you're struggling with a chronic health condition or just looking to find a little more energy for your day, this is the show for you. Protein. It's something that a lot of people on plant-based diets are concerned about, and perhaps rightfully so, because as I've covered in a number of recent articles and videos, there are some health downsides to radically undershooting your protein targets, as many people on raw food diets or even just general, not particularly well-focused cooked vegan diets do. So if you want to avoid having those bone health and muscle mass loss and immune system function downgrades that go along with less than ideal protein intakes, you might take a couple paths. One is to try to get more protein from whole foods. Another is just saying, I don't want to be that disciplined with my eating and going with a protein supplement. So we could have a lengthy discussion about whether or not it's a good idea to get your protein from processed protein supplements. And that could be lengthy. But I know that people are going to go that route regardless of what we may determine in such a discussion. And so I think it's worth talking about, regardless of what you think about eating a processed protein supplement, is the finished product going to be contaminated with heavy metals like lead and cadmium? So to help me explore this topic, I've invited on Jacklyn Bowen, who runs the nonprofit Clean Label Project, which basically investigates the contamination levels in a variety of supplement products, some processed foods like baby foods and dog foods, to talk about what the potential risk here is. So without further ado, let's move on to the interview. Jackie, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So could we start off by talking a little bit about your organization and the work you guys do, specifically regarding the cleanliness or the non-toxicity of supplement products?
Yes. So first, maybe a little bit about Clean Label Project. So Clean Label Project is a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered here in Denver, Colorado. And our overall mission is to bring truth and transparency to consumer product labeling. So what that really boils down to is we look to empower consumers with information using exclusively data and science. In other words, from our perspective, marketing departments can do a pretty effective job when it comes to selling comfort and security via labeling claims. So for us, analytical chemistry doesn't lie. And what we do is we test some of America's best-selling products, and we evaluate them using actual accredited analytical chemistry laboratory results, and use that to make a 5-star rating system and post those results online at cleanlabelproject.org. Now, as you were speaking to specifically what we did for protein powder, so I'll give you a little bit of background first on why this study really appealed to me. So for me, I'm a vegetarian, and it was one where it was coming up on the new year. So many people are looking to, either lose weight, start working out. In other words, just start those New Year's resolutions and start the new year off on the right foot. And so many of us reach for protein powders to supplement our already healthy lifestyle choices. So for me, it was one of looking at, well, what's really in some of these breakfast smoothies? And so that's what really was the impetus for this study. What was behind the label claims, and what can we look at in terms of industrial and environmental contaminants in what we have in breakfast almost every day?
So before we go into exactly what you found, could we talk a little bit about the regulatory environment that surrounds food supplements and how that might be a little bit different than, just regular fruits and veggies that you would get at the grocery store?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really great point to provide some background information. So, overall, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, does a really effective job when it comes to things like microbiological contamination or things like pathogens, things you hear about related to salmonella, E. coli, listeria, things you sometimes hear about in burrito restaurants or cruise ships, things that have the potential to make you very sick tomorrow. And the FDA does a very diligent job when it comes to kind of traditional food safety and looking at traditional food. But when it comes to things like functional foods or dietary supplements, obviously the FDA has their hands full when it comes to just traditional food. And dietary supplements, in many ways, really goes under the radar. So for us, instead of just looking at things like microbiological or bacterial contamination, things that we look at are more so industrial environmental contaminants. And it's important to note that these are things that you would never find on a product label, but have the potential to cause adverse health effects in the long term. And I'll explain a little bit about that. So basically what it means is that we look for things like heavy metal contamination. Things like lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, things like persistent pesticides, antibiotic residues. Now, it's important to note that these aren't going to be things that show up tomorrow and cause adverse health effects. More so, these have a latency effect of 15 to 20 years. So it's almost like the way I like to think of it is, as a society, we spend a lot of time concerned about, let's say, the effects of cigarette smoking and the long-term effects on things like your lungs. And it's very clear, looking at the different academic literature that is available, that lead causes cancer. Acrylamides are a neurotoxin. Cadmium is causes cancer. There's different types of heavy metals that they're not going to have an impact on your health tomorrow, but daily routine exposure in the long term could cause an adverse health effect. And so those are the things that we're looking at, just because at the federal level, very limited attention is paid to these types of things.
So just as kind of a note to the audience who may not have the background, so you're talking about heavy metals, lead probably being one of the most famously problematic. You go back to the 1960s and 1970s, back when we had leaded gasoline, and we had levels of lead in human blood that were somewhere around 400 times what prehistoric, pre-industrial revolution humans had. And the data that we have indicates really clearly that we suffered loss of mental function and things like people becoming less rational because of the way that this affected them, outside of the fact that like other diseases, cancer, and other problems cropped up there. So, we have this regulatory background. In the United States, we no longer have leaded gasoline, and levels have fallen dramatically. But the Center for Disease Control in the United States has basically said there is no acceptable intake level that we found that provides zero damage. It's more like, what can we realistically achieve? So, the FDA has set like 5 micrograms per day, for instance, for lead, and we're basically striving to move in the right direction as opposed to totally clean it up because it's viewed as unrealistic. So, could you talk a little bit about like how do you even go about measuring that, and are the standards dramatically different for instance, Europe? I don't know how much you know about their regulatory environment, or other countries that are developed, and how do those compare to the United States?
Sure. So one of the things that I always the perspective I always take a clean label project is that exposure to less industrial environmental contaminants is always better than more. And so when we go online and we test and we post the results for the different protein powders, in this case is 136 protein powders, the stance that we take is that in the absence of federal regulation, we need to rely on something. And what we do within Clean Label Project, in this case, when it comes to heavy metal contamination, we rely on the state of California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And essentially, what this office does is it uses different toxicology information to suggest maximum tolerant levels of exposure for people on a daily basis. And we use that as a source of inspiration. The other source of inspiration of the way we go about our testing is that we benchmark. So what this means is if we went and we tested 136 of the best-selling protein powders in America, what we can look at is, for example, the lead levels. And when we test 136 products, you get 136 different lead levels. And I know, I was just looking at the raw data the other day, that the product that had the most amount of lead averaged 123 parts per billion of lead. Now, there's other ones that have absolutely zero. And to put that number into perspective, the maximum amount of lead that would be the action limit by the Environmental Protection Agency in water is 10 parts per billion. So literally this one particular product that, happened to be the one that was the most contaminated had nearly 10 times as much. So for us, it's one of relying on those two different areas in order to do the testing. Now, kind of looking over the pond to Europe, again, that's a different kind of, the rules there are different in terms of maximum levels of exposure when it comes to heavy metals. I would have to specifically look to see how it applies within kind of protein powders and dietary supplements. But I know from doing work in the infant formula and baby food space, they have even tighter controls for foods that target, some of the most vulnerable populations.
I've looked on your website and I see that you've got this star system where how contaminated is it? But you don't actually, as far as I could find, provide the raw data, which makes it a little hard if you, for instance, know that the Centers for Disease Control basically says that if you're probably at increased risk for a number of issues regarding, for instance, lead, because we've been talking about that. If you're over 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood, and you can kind of do the math to figure out how many parts per billion that would be to achieve that. So do you post that anywhere so people can actually do the math, or are you just relying on this star system, which is kind of ambiguous?
No, absolutely. The raw data is online. You can go right to cleanlabelproject.org. Under the section called Category Summaries, you're going to want to just scroll down and you'll see where it says protein powder, and it'll have a little caret to the right where it has more drop-down menus. And there you can see the protein powder brand report cards, the raw data, just an infographic of our overall findings on this category, the top 5, bottom 5, as well as some frequently asked questions that we see specific to that category. One thing that I also wanted to mention, just based on what we were talking about, is there was a really fascinating journal article that came out, it's probably been 2 weeks now, and it was in the public health journal Lancet. And basically, it was a 10-year study that was done using blood results, lead level blood results. And what they found in this journal article was a link between lead exposure and heart disease, literally linking lead exposure to nearly 250,000 deaths in America. And again, their overall recommendation is that lead is almost this silent contributor to so many of these kind of long-term diseases that can develop. But again, it's one when we start looking at dietary exposure, that's still at this point where, in terms of the regulatory system that exists, it's still quite limited and still in its infancy.
So if we think about food, there's no way to totally eliminate heavy metals, be they arsenic or lead or mercury, from the food, because it's present naturally. Even before you take a look at pollution, it's present naturally in the Earth's crust, and plants will take those up. So how do you as an organization kind of go about rating this in terms of, well, if we just pulverize a bunch of quinoa or whatever and turn that into a powder, how much does it have to be present for it to be abnormal and dangerous, in your opinion?
Right. So I guess I would say this, is that, yes, the statement that lead and different heavy metals can be found in the Earth's crust is definitely, that's a true statement. However, I will say this, and this was actually Clean Label Project before doing this protein powder story. We did a infant formula baby food category study as well as a pet food study. And one of the things that I found so interesting in the infant formula and baby food study is I would get a lot of questions from industry. It would be like, well, wait a second, heavy metals are naturally occurring. And I'm like, yep, heavy metals can be naturally occurring. However, this claim that they're just ubiquitous across and uniform across all environments is not a true statement. In fact, when looking at infant formula and baby foods, we found that in that case, we tested over 600 of the top selling infant formulas and baby foods. And we found lead, measurable levels of lead, so just detectable lead, 4 parts per billion and greater, in 45% of the products, which means that 55% of the products did not have lead levels that exceeded 4 parts per billion. And what does this mean, and why is it important? Well, it really comes down to two things. Is that for those 55% of the products that did not have lead, one of two things happened. Either one, that those manufacturers are intentionally sourcing ingredients from cleaner soils, because let's be honest, where heavy metal contamination can occur in the soil is through persistent use of pesticides, because the breakdown components are many times arsenic, copper, lead, and those types of things. It's not straight from the crust. There are different human elements that can add to the contamination within the soil. So in the first case, it could be that one, they're intentionally sourcing from cleaner soils, or two, that they happen to be formulating with lower risk ingredients. And elaborate a little bit on number two. So different types of things that obviously when you test, in the case of protein powder, 136 of the top selling protein powders for over 130 industrial environmental contaminants, you acquire thousands of data points. And from these data points, you can see trends. And you not only see these trends specifically within protein powder, but when you look at infant formula and baby food and arguably even pet food, you can draw different correlations and similarities. In other words, I know from looking at the different products that in general, soy and rice pull higher levels of arsenic from the soil. Now, it just may be that those crops just from their own biochemistry have that capability, or it could just be that where those crops happen to be grown happen to have a higher concentration of these metals in the soil. But it's also one that it allows us that ability to be a little bit more cognizant that if you're looking to reduce your exposure to heavy metals, there are certain ingredients that you may want to minimize.
Now, you mentioned that your theory is that if these crop fields were grown conventionally with conventional pesticides and such, that they could have higher levels of these heavy metals. But if I'm understanding your work correctly, you didn't find really that organic certified products had lower levels, right?
That's correct, and it was one of those things that, at least for me, before actually coming to Clean Label Project, I've spent a lot of my professional life in the organic certification space, and so I'm very much an organic consumer at heart. But sometimes when you use analytical chemistry, sometimes the results will fly in the face of conventional wisdom. And the thing that was interesting to me is that when looking at the results of organic versus non-organic of protein powders, organic generally had higher levels of heavy metals. And the same thing held true if you were to look over into the infant formula and baby food space, that organic baby food tended to have higher amounts of metals. Now, I don't know positively what the root cause of that is, but I will say this, is that when looking at protein powders, I think the causation is not necessarily that it's certified organic, rather that it's something north of 70% of the products that I tested happened to be organic and plant-based. And therefore, because they were plant-based, they had a higher, tendency or concentration to use some of those higher risk ingredients. Again, like the rice and the soy that I had mentioned before.
And I suppose it also could be that, we a lot of people think organic means that nothing in terms of a chemical was put on it, but it's really just a classification of chemical which is deemed natural. So I could be wrong here, but I don't think, for instance, like copper sulfate is considered a organic pesticide, and there's other metals that are present in organic pesticides and fertilizers. So there could just be, it's not necessarily that the organic is going to be cleaner because there's something in what's being put on.
That's possible, and I'm a little in terms of the actual National Organic Program, regulatory authority in terms of how it rules that. I'm not exactly sure, but it also is an overarching theme of, at the end of the day, we have to sleep in the bed that we made, and the topsoil quality and the pesticides that have been applied, across the country for years now, that we're starting to see this manifest itself in the foods that we feed ourselves and our families.
So having done this, I don't know if you'd call it a study or this testing program, have you now had to reevaluate anything in your life in terms of what you were eating, be it a protein powder or anything like that?
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Well, it's interesting. I'll be honest. I had been. I ran out of my own protein powder. Gosh, it's probably like 6 months ago, and then I just didn't go back, and I moved and I didn't unpack my Vitamix, and so I haven't been using protein powder for a while, but for like 6 months or so. But what I was using at the time, I didn't even test it. I probably should have. It was a pumpkin seed protein powder, so I'd be interested in seeing what was in that. But it's another thing, of course, that in addition, in no way do I, want the findings of this study to detract people from either, not using protein powder, or alternatively, for people like myself that are vegetarian and look to follow a clean diet as much as possible. I mean, it's one where it's important to note that, yes, you find ones that are contaminated, but there's so many great products that are on the list, compared to others. So it's one where you can look at it, find something that works for you in terms of your own dietary commitments and lifestyle choices. It's one where people will say, well, like, which protein powder should I use? And the thing that's interesting is that the 5 cleanest protein powders happen to all be whey, and they happen to all be vanilla, which, in no way do I, myself, would I go and, necessarily make the choice to swap, choose from vegan protein over into a whey-based protein. But it is interesting of, why is it that the 5 cleanest happen to be whey-based and vanilla? But specific to the vanilla, that's an interesting one, is because the top-selling flavors of protein powders are mostly chocolate and then, of course, vanilla. But it's interesting because if you do some research on chocolate, what you see is that chocolate has a greater tendency to pull cadmium from the soil. So there's been all kinds of studies and lawsuits over on the West Coast related to things like this. And so overall, what you see is that vanilla happens to be a cleaner choice. But check out our website at cleanlabelproject.org. Look at the protein powders. And of course, there's ones that are plant-based or whey-based, egg-based, that you can find that meets your own, lifestyle choices and dietary needs. And of course, I always encourage people to, evaluate where you can, using different types of whole foods that, of your different types of peanut butters and things like that can also help supplement your protein. So that's also an option.
Great. And what are you hoping will come out of this? It's not cheap to do these studies, so you've obviously found supporters to donate to your organization, and you're doing this testing. Are you hoping to influence the federal government to step up testing and regulation, or are you where are you hoping this whole thing will go?
Yes, so I can tell you definitively that the overall objective for Clean Label Project is to change the definition of food and consumer product safety in America. And when it comes to food, hands down, it's specific to evaluating food safety based on the long-term health implications, as opposed to just focusing on the things, or not just focusing, but having majority of the focus on different types of microbiological contamination. So for us, given all the scientific evidence that has been coming out related to the long-term effects of dietary exposure to things like arsenic and lead, and of course things like just few years ago now that the Center of Disease Control came out and said that the single biggest threat to public health and safety was the subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics in livestock, contributing to the emergence of superbugs. Just a few years ago, you even had the United Nations meeting for the fourth time in history on a health-related matter. And again, that was given the rise of antibiotic resistance. So it's one where, what is this stuff? Why is it showing up in our food? And it needs to be something that's evaluated much more at the brand level and making those changes at the federal level. And that's the change and awareness that Clean Label Project is looking to drive.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you're looking for information on which protein powders are relatively low in heavy metals, because really none of them are totally clean, you can look at cleanlabelproject.org. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. If you enjoyed this and you want to support my work and the free articles and videos that I produce, you can do that at renaissancehumans.com/support. You can support my work with as little as $1 a month or make a one-time donation through the links there. Also, it would be super helpful if you would go onto the iTunes store and give us a 5-star review and write a couple sentences about why you enjoy this podcast. It'll help it reach more people. Thanks.